Hi, I'm Brett Michael Phillips, and I'm here to talk to you today about one of my favorite subjects, the truth. And I'm guessing if you're watching this video, you're a truth hound just like me. I love the truth. I've always been obsessed with the truth, understanding what's real, what's true, how things work, what really happened. And just so you know, sometimes in my life, this has caused a lot of problems. I remember when I was a young man, and even as a boy, my mother would ask me, she'd say, Brent, do you want to be right? Or do you want people to like you? Now, in my youth, I didn't even hesitate. I wanted to be right. Just so you know, I backed off a little bit of that as I've matured. But for today, we're going to stick to the truth. We're going to talk about the truth about truth. And this is really important. My late mentor Carl would sometimes say that there are three pillars that our lives and our spiritual progress are based upon. One is the truth. The other two, in case you're curious, are love and beauty. Now, this guy's been a little more challenged on love and beauty than the truth. So we're going to stick to what I'm really good at here and talk about the truth. This is going to be a series of 5 videos on the truth about truth. And if you want to get the most out of this, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is be willing to let go of the things you think you know about the truth. Why is that? Well, it's quite simple. You can't learn something if you think you already know it. You also can't learn something until you already almost know it. And we have to get those two factors in confluence to grow, to move ahead, to discover real truth, to launch our lives forward. So let's talk about the truth. The first thing I want to mention, and this may surprise you a little bit, is that everything in life is a story. Everything in life is a hologram. It's an illusion. It's a projection. This is important if we want to really understand truth. So what do I mean by that? Well, the fact is, we can never, through our physical bodies, our senses, our minds, experience something as it is for real in the present moment. That is literally impossible. You go, what do you mean, Brent? I can look at my watch and see what time it is. I can eat a burrito and it's tasty. Well, here's what I mean. Let's say that I look at my cell phone sitting on my desk here. Am I actually seeing the phone as it is in the present moment? No, you're not. What you're actually seeing is a projection of the phone as it existed in the past. How does that work? Well, it's actually pretty simple. How is it that I see the phone? Well, what happens is there's a light. The light comes off the light bulb, hits the phone reflects the light that goes into my eye, that goes into my optic nerve and paints an image in my brain, and I see the phone. All those things take time. It takes some finite, very small but finite amount of time for the light to bounce off the phone and come to my eye. It also takes a small but finite amount of time for that light to go through my optic nerve and for a signal to be sent through my nervous system into my brain to paint the image in what we call the mind. That's what I mean when I say we cannot directly experience reality with our physical senses and our biology. There is an inherent delay built in. All we can do is experience something as it was at some point in the past, heavily influenced by filters of biology as well as consciousness. So as another example, you know that when you're watching this YouTube video that it is transmitted across time. Of course it is, right? I'm sitting here in my office recording this, and you may be watching this a month, a year, 10 years, who knows, maybe 100 years later. All of our communication is like that. Even if we're sitting in the same room 6 inches away. When I speak, that words, the vibration of the air, takes some time to transmit. So when you hear it, what you're hearing is something that happened in the past. Now, that's not a big deal. Why? These are all models that closely approximate reality. And this is going to be a big topic later in the series, is models. I just want you to see for now that everything we experience, even things that seem so true, like me sitting looking at my cell phone, what you're actually seeing is a projection from the past. It's not the real truth in the moment. Even though my eyes may be very good, I had laser surgery in the 90s. I've had, thank God, pretty good vision ever since. And there's pretty good lighting in here. I still can't see the phone as it exists in the moment. I'm only seeing a projection of it as the light bounces off of it and comes into my eyes. Beyond that, if we look at the way that the human eye perceives reality, it's only seeing a tiny fraction of what's out there. One of the scientific facts that blew my mind when I learned this was this, that if you took the whole electromagnetic spectrum, All the radio waves, X-rays, gamma waves, microwaves, visible light, infrared, all that. And you stretched it out onto a spectrum that we said was arbitrarily 2,000 miles. So all the different frequencies of light that exist in nature is on a spectrum that's 2,000 miles, roughly the distance from California to Alaska. How much of that would the human eye see? The answer is about 2 inches. So our eyes are only tuned to a certain very small wavelength of light, very narrow band. There's so much more going on in the universe that our biology is completely incapable of seeing on its own. A good example would be radio waves. We all know about radios, right? There's these invisible radio waves moving through the air. You cannot hear them with your physical biology. But with the right electronic device, you get a little pocket radio or your cell phone or your computer or whatever, you can tune in and create a device that amplifies the radio waves into sound waves we can understand. So pretty simple concept, right? The radio waves are out there all the time, but our biology is not tuned to them. We need help from electronics to expand our awareness to hear it. So all I'm saying for right now is just realize that the amount of truth that our human brains and biology can experience and process is a tiny, tiny fraction of what's out there, vanishingly small. But nature is very clever. It's tuned us to see a highly useful section of that electromagnetic spectrum. Therefore, we can experience and see what we call truth. And so, next step, what exactly is truth? So we tend to think that truth is something that's just always true. I'm going to push back and say not quite. First is that truth is always relative to a context. So what does that mean? Well, it's pretty simple. If we take something like the strength of gravity on the surface of the Earth, that's about as close to truth as we can get, right? Because no matter where you go, you measure gravity at sea level on the surface of the Earth, you're going to get the same number, roughly 9.8 meters per second squared. I don't care if you're Mother Teresa or Adolf Hitler, you're going to get the same result, right? That's pretty close to truth. What I want you to see is that truth about gravity is relative to a context. What's the context? The context is the surface of the Earth. So you can measure the strength of gravity 1,000,000 times at the surface of the Earth. You're always going to get the same answer. But if you change the context, the truth changes with it. That's one of the really important things to know if you're on a quest to find truth. Not only do we discover truth, equally important is the context in which the truth exists. Very simply, if you take a rocket up into outer space and you measure gravity, you get a different number. It's going to be much smaller, isn't it? Of course it is. Why? You've changed the context. So if there's just one thing to take away from this lesson about truth, is that truth is always relative to a context. I'm not sure there is such a thing as absolute truth. Why? I don't think there's an absolute context. Albert Einstein famously said, "There is no preferred frame of reference in the universe." What does that mean? It means that no one context is inherently superior or better than another. Everything is relative. That's what led to his theory of relativity. So back to more mundane truths and esoteric truths in terms of day-to-day experience and things that matter to your life. Is a truth real or is it not? Well, that depends on the context. Now, some people will say that there are absolute truths, things that are always the same no matter what. My answer to that would be, there is not such a thing as an absolute truth, but there is such a thing as a context which is so big we cannot escape from it. Therefore, any measurements we make, any experiments we undertake, relying on that truth will always validate it. As an example with gravity, if you're stuck on the surface of the Earth and you measure gravity 1,000,000 times, you're going to get the same answer. Why? Within that context, it is an absolute. But if we change the context, if we go up into outer space, heck, if we dig a deep tunnel underground, that will change the strength of gravity. Why? We've changed the context. So I would offer this, that an absolute truth isn't really absolute. An absolute truth is a truth that exists within a context that is so big that we cannot escape from it. That's the difference between what I would call relative and absolute truths. A relative truth always has a context. An absolute truth still has a context, but the context is so big that as human beings with our current level of science and spirituality, we cannot escape from it. So if you imagine Stone Age man, his context is pretty much stuck at the surface of the earth, right? So they measure gravity, always going to get the same answer. Some of these things we talk about in terms of spiritual truth, I want you to keep in the back of your mind. That's always relative to some context. Now that context might be being human. In other words, no matter when you live or where you live or how smart you are, or how rich you are, or how evolved you are, there are some truths that are always going to be truth within the context of human experience. So those are what we call close to absolute truths. And of course, you all know that there's higher dimensions in the universe, right? I'll talk a little more about that later in the series. There is at least 12 dimensions in the universe. Some will say 24, others would say 48, 53, 72, 36, a lot of different numbers thrown out there. I wouldn't get too hung up on that kind of brain candy, unless you're a physicist trying to crack the grand unified theory, right? The theory of everything. But aside from that, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we recognize there are more dimensions. And our experience as humans is relative to a certain dimensionality, a certain biology, a certain context. So all truth is relative to a context. And if you really want to discover truth, you need to not only discover the truth, but also clearly define the context in which it was found. We see a similar example for this in the world of archaeology. That it's great if you find some example of ancient pottery or an old scroll or even a dinosaur bone. But what I've heard about archaeology is that over 90% of the value and information isn't in the object, it's in the context. It's where it was discovered, what was near it, what else was around it. So if you have some treasure hunter that goes and finds some beautiful golden crown buried somewhere in Egypt, if they take it out of that context and go sell it, you've lost over 90% of the archaeological historical value. Why? Truth is relative to a context. And you can't really understand the truth unless you also clearly define and understand the context in which it exists. So, pretty cool stuff, right? Next thing I want to mention, and this may surprise you, is that as human beings, even as spiritual beings, we can only approximate the truth. We can never find it exactly. Why is this? Well, it's pretty simple. Everything we experience through our human biology is a story. I mentioned earlier about looking at your phone on the table. You're not seeing the phone as it is. You're seeing a limited projection of it as it was in the past. So our biology influences how much truth we can see. Even beyond that, our belief systems, our consciousness, our internal mythology, our prejudice, our behaviors, our history, our traumas, all colors and influences the truth. And we're going to go into a lot more detail later in the series when we talk about how our consciousness influences our personal truth, as well as what you can do to change it. Because it's so cool, we can actually go in and reprogram ourselves to experience a different perspective, have a different relationship to what is. And of course, that's a lot of what we're doing with the spiritual work. But for now, just know that everything is a story. Everything is a mythology. We can't directly touch reality. We can only approximate it with models. And our physical biology and our consciousness, our belief systems, the subconscious, are the primary things that influence and color that. That's not bad though, because I would say within that understanding, what is truth? Well, truth is a verifiable story. That's all. As an example, again, gravity. If we measure the strength of gravity on the surface of the earth, you can measure it at 1,000 different places at sea level. You're going to get the same answer. Assuming you have good equipment and there's no errors in it, right? You're going to get the same answer. But that's okay. That's useful because now we know what that strength is. And we can go build airplanes and helicopters and spacecraft and tall buildings, knowing that even though that truth of gravity is a story, it's a verifiable story. It's one we can go experiment and see for ourselves and verify that it is true. So those are two really important points. Again, number one, all truth is relative to a context. And two, everything we experience as humans is a story, a projection. The trouble comes, of course, when we, as they say, confuse the map for the territory. Because our human biology cannot directly experience the territory. It can only experience the map. The map is the model. It fits in our brain. Why? Reality does not fit inside a human brain, any more so than your human eye can see across the whole electromagnetic spectrum, any more so than you can't fit an 18-wheeler in your garage, can you? It's nothing personal. There's nothing wrong with your garage. There's nothing wrong with the 18-wheeler. It just doesn't fit. What does fit in the human brain is a model, a map. The good news is when we're aware that we're dealing with models and maps, we can understand the limitations of them, and we can start to discover real truth. And within that relative context, when we discover the truth and clearly identify the context, that truth becomes a verifiable phenomena. It really works. I'll sometimes talk about building airplanes. My father was an aeronautical engineer, so I grew up fascinated by airplanes and airplane technology. And so it's pretty simple. There's certain things that work to build an airplane. It all comes down to lift and drag. If you have more lift than drag, you can fly. If there's too much drag, not enough lift, you crash, you hit the ground. There are certain ways of building airplanes that work. That's the truth. But again, notice it's within a relative context. That would be near the surface of the Earth with atmosphere. This, by the way, is why airplanes have what they call a ceiling. They can only fly so high. Why? Above that, there's not enough atmosphere. So these ways of working that work when you're within 10 or 20 or 30,000 feet of the surface of the Earth suddenly break down. And how is this relevant to your life? I want to wrap it all up here. All the spiritual teachings you've learned, law of attraction, consciousness, even awakening, just know they are all relative to a context. And when you take a truth out of its context, it breaks. It is no longer the truth. And some contexts are obvious. It might be a physical location, like with gravity, the surface of the Earth versus the moon or Mars or a space station, right? Different context, different gravity. Sometimes though, and this is the kicker, the context is your consciousness. And so people of different levels of consciousness will actually experience different truths. And this can be so frustrating because you've discovered the truth. It's helped you heal, it's helped you grow. Maybe you experienced a physical medical healing, an emotional healing. You've been able to manifest, use the law of attraction, elevate your consciousness, develop intuition, see auras. That's awesome. But what happens if someone else has a different consciousness? You can give them those same teachings, those same processes, and they will not work any more than an airplane won't fly at 100,000 feet. So if you like this, I got a whole series of these videos coming. If you haven't done so yet, please hit like, please hit subscribe. I know you don't want to miss out. If you'd like to learn more about me and my work, I'm going to put a little URL on the video right now. There you go. That's called my Spiritual Power Quiz. If you haven't done it already, it's a cool little thing. It's designed to take you about 2 minutes and help you reveal your hidden spiritual power. And I really want to encourage you to do this because after you do your Spiritual Power Quiz, I'm also going to send you an invitation to one of my live webinar events where you can experience some of the advanced levels of this work, talking about awakening, experience quantum field beaming, shifting your consciousness, seeing energy and auras with your open eyes, because my goal is to unfold the truth for you, to give you the tools, the foundations, the teaching, the support, so you can expand the truth that fits inside your brain. Because even though truth is really powerful, it's also beautiful in its own right. And if you're watching this video to the end, I know you're a truth hound just like me. So stay tuned. I got some other cool videos about truth coming up, but that's all I got to say for right now. So Brent Michael Phillips signing off, and I hope to see you again very soon in another one of my videos or maybe on one of my live events. Until then, take care and namaste.